This video is sponsored by Nebula, the thoughtful streaming service created by me and my creator friends. Check out the link in the description or stay tuned to learn more. Since I started making YouTube videos, one place I've been asked about again and again is Germany's Rhine-Ruhr region, which naturally sits at the confluence of the Rhine and Ruhr rivers in western Germany, between Paris, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt. The Rhine-Ruhr region is fascinating because it takes an incredibly polycentric form, unlike most of the world's large urban areas, and for transit because this polycentrism creates structures and indeed a network which is interconnected like no other, with S-Bahns, an S-Bahn, and frequent regional express trains crossing in every which way, and forming more than a spaghetti bowl of lines, but a whole table of spaghetti bowls. And the Rhine-Ruhr region also has some amazing things it isn't really known for, like a whole lot of cross-platform transfers. So with that, let's take a look at Germany's largest transit metropolis. Welcome to RM Transit, a YouTube channel about transit in Germany, Europe, and around the world. Consider supporting my channel on Patreon for early draft videos and to help me keep explaining the world's transit. As I mentioned in our intro, the Rhine-Ruhr region is at the junction between the Rhine and Ruhr rivers, which is in the city of Duisburg, and given their importance for inland waterway shipping, made the area the country's industrial heartland. The region is the largest in Germany for population and has a GDP which rivals many countries. To be clear, the Rhine-Ruhr is not a city, but a rather unique polycentric region made up of many distinct cities, including Dortmund, Bochum, Essen, Wuppertal, Duisburg, and Düsseldorf, which altogether have over 8 million residents. Now, some consider Cologne and Bonn, which lie to the south of Düsseldorf, forming a large arrow shape, to be part of the region, and that's fair enough. But they do have a separate ticketing organization, and because they're sort of south of the rest of the region, more tightly interconnected with each other because they alone have nearly 3 million residents, and because this video is going to be huge anyways, I'm going to tackle them in their own dedicated video in the future, so make sure to get subscribed for that. Now, of course, such a large region has a number of major transportation hubs. The Rhine-Ruhr region's main long-distance air hub is Düsseldorf Airport, which lies between central Düsseldorf and Duisburg, while its main intercity rail hub is actually Cologne Hauptbahnhof, which provides connections into the Low Countries, although Düsseldorf and Essen Hauptbahnhofs are also among Germany's busiest. While each of the cities and even many of the towns in the region have their own public transport systems, they're coordinated by the VRR, which manages the integrated ticketing scheme, sets standards, and coordinates schedules, allowing for both local control and direction, as well as integrated travel for the public. In addition, VRR owns an increasingly large portion of the trains which operate in the region, bringing more assets into public control. And with that, let's actually get into the public transport systems, starting with the S-Bahns, the uniquely German tram-metro hybrids that you can find in Stuttgart, Frankfurt, and all over the Rhine-Ruhr. These systems were meant to gradually turn trams into metros by adding city center tunnels and removing crossings elsewhere, though that's never actually been fully achieved. What's interesting is that while almost every city in the Rhine-Ruhr has a S-Bahn, each of them is quite distinct, with different styles of operation, a mix of high and low floor vehicles, and even different rail gauges. As you might remember from my video on Stuttgart, many S-Bahn systems had their origins, even if only in terms of shared standards, with older tram systems, and because many of those tram systems were narrow gauge, so too are some of the S-Bahn lines. Now, there have actually long been plans to bring together the various S-Bahn systems in the Rhine-Ruhr region into one giant system, and to accomplish this, plans were meant to standardize technologies and rail gauge, but things haven't quite worked out that way. And so while a big burst of work happened in the latter half of the 20th century, the system remains disconnected and a jumble of different technology. Starting with Dortmund, the city has a mixed system of high and low floor vehicles, which are all on standard gauge and, like all lines in the region, are powered by 750 volt DC overhead wires. The low floor line cuts across the city east-west, forming a triangle transfer along its central tunnel with the two north-south high floor lines, which cross each other at Stadtgarten. The low floor line fans out to two branches, one short and one very long, in its east, while the high floor lines create 3 northern and 4 southern branches, 2 of which are connected together by the U45 service. All told, Dortmund's system is quite large, with 75 kilometers of track and 82 stations, a significant portion of which is underground, especially for the high floor system. This is very important because the city has no remaining conventional trams, unlike every other city in the region. Bochum has a single high-floor standard gauge S-Bahn line, which runs north-south through the city almost entirely underground, and a more extensive meter gauge legacy tram network. That single north-south line has 22 stops and runs over 15 kilometers, being the vestige of that plan to interconnect all of the stop-on systems with a standard gauge spine, with spurs shooting off into each city. This is particularly sad because Bochum Hauptbahnhof was created as a massive underground facility for the Stadtbahn, with planned cross-platform transfers and the like. Fortunately, this infrastructure ended up being utilized for the core of the tram network, which is all underground, and a bit of a pattern we'll see repeating. But these are distinct from low-floor Stadtbahn because of their lower speed and lower quality surface infrastructure. As you can see, the history of the region has led to some rather odd situations, though I do think a cross-platform transfer between two lines with different gauges and floor heights is rather neat. Essen is much like Bochum in that it has a network that is a combination of both high-floor standard gauge Stadtbahn and low-floor meter gauge tram. However, Essen's system is longer, with 43 stations over 22 kilometers of track. As of today, the network consists of a mostly underground north-south line through the city, a southwestern branch, and a line to the city of Mülheim to the west, mostly above ground in the middle of an autobahn, and entirely grade-separated, forming a component of the once-planned regional Stadtbahn network, and seen as a model for future lines on said network. Speaking of Mülheim, the city naturally has its own meter gauge tram network, which while not entirely underground through the central city, does feature a tunnel in the city center which carries some tram services and yet again allows for cross-platform transfers. Back to Essen, like in Bochum, additional Stadtbahn tunnels and infrastructure were built in the city center, which was instead used to underground the core of the tram network, enabling yet another tram and Stadtbahn cross-platform interchange, this time at Essen Hauptbahnhof. However, unlike in Bochum, some of the Stadtbahn infrastructure is actually shared by trams using dual-gauge tracks, which operate some U-branded services and have movable steps to allow boarding from low and high platforms. I also do have to mention that some of the rolling stock on the Essen Stadtbahn was formerly used on London's DLR system, which is a wacky bit of transit trivia and highlights the technical origins of the system in London. Duisburg probably has the least substantial system of all, with a city center tunnel that has 6 different stops for the city's Stadtbahn, which, like with the line between Essen and Mülheim, runs to the next city over, Düsseldorf in this case. All in all, the Stadtbahn route runs about 16 kilometers to the south of the city, and just like with Essen and Bochum, the center of Duisburg has a larger city center tunnel network, with the additional tunnels being used by the city's trams, which in this case are actually standard gauge, with a 2-level cross-platform transfer being offered between tram and Stadtbahn services. The line to Düsseldorf is an interesting interurban, because while the northern bits within Duisburg operate like conventional on-street tram trackage, the line eventually goes grade-separated, with several dramatic elevated sections, as well as segments through rural farm fields between Duisburg and Düsseldorf. Now, Düsseldorf has the largest Stadtbahn system of all, which, like the one in Dortmund at the other end of the region, is split between low-floor and high-floor routes, with 3 low branches to the east and 3 to the south converging through a low-floor cross-city tunnel opened in 2016. Meanwhile, the high-floor lines, which feature 3 southern branches and 5 northern branches, feed into a quad-track cross-city tunnel, which, as you're expecting, allows for a cross-platform transfer at the Hauptbahnhof, and also connects to the low-floor cross-city tunnel at Heinrich-Heine-Allee with infrastructure that was prepared decades in advance of the more recent cross-city route. And like a lot of Stadtbahn tunnels in the Rhine-Ruhr region, it has all manner of extra spurs and other track segments designed to allow for future expansion should that ever be desired. Now, some of the high-floor branches to the north actually run into neighboring cities, with the U70 and U76 running to the northwest to Krefeld. And since we're on the topic of Krefeld, I think it's worth noting that that city does have its own modest meter gauge tram network, like so many in the region. There are a lot of trams here. The other northern branch, carrying the U79 route, of course runs up to Duisburg, passing just west of the Düsseldorf airport, and what's neat is that when it crosses the city center and runs next to the other northern branches, it crosses over with them, forming a huge X, and actually running south to interline along with the U76 route with parts of the low-floor Stadtbahn network in the south of Düsseldorf, with some stations having both high and low platforms. If you're curious where the cross-city low-floor route came from, it's a bit of a shift from the old model of creating Stadtbahn lines as semi-rapid transit, and instead it was decided that the new cross-city route and the tram lines which fed into it would be kept as low-floor, as with the rest of the Düsseldorf tram network, which is also standard gauge. This makes sense to an extent because the low-floor Stadtbahn routes are just former tram lines after all, and by using tram-style vehicles, the issue of high-floor vehicles on tram-style routes that require passengers to climb stairs to get on board, an accessibility nightmare you can find in a number of Rhine-Ruhr cities, was eliminated. That being said, it's hard not to see the lower barrier to entry to running routes into the Stadtbahn tunnel as likely to lead to the watering down of the system over time. That being said, thanks to this, the Düsseldorf Stadtbahn is really big, with 165 stations and 99 kilometers of track, and even more is being built, with a Stadtbahn extension to Düsseldorf Airport set to open soon. Stepping back, I hope you can start to see how the various Rhine-Ruhr Stadtbahn are similar, and while it's not the topic of this video, the same can be said for the systems in Cologne and Bonn. With a little imagination, you can also imagine how all of the systems could have been linked into that giant interconnected system, with a few more sections of line between Dortmund and Bochum, Bochum and Essen, and Mülheim and Duisburg. And who knows, maybe it will still happen one day, but probably not. And that's because, while with all the systems interconnected, you could ride Stadtbahns all the way from one end of the region to another, it's not like anyone would want to do this, and it's unlikely any service would actually run the whole length, since it would create a line that's way too long to operate reliably, although it would be good as a backup for the mainline service in those rare times when it's not operating. Also, well, every city but Dortmund is actually already connected when you take the tram networks into account, including with some weird dual-gauge track where the trams from Duisburg run into Mülheim. Instead, like with most big German urban areas, the Rhine-Ruhr region is interconnected by a series of S-Bahn lines, with some S-Bahn services running to each city and interconnecting with the Stadtbahns at both the main stations and other outlying locations. The S-Bahn system is gigantic, with 124 stations spread over nearly 700 kilometers of track, and 16 different services electrified with 15 kilovolt AC overhead lines. Let's go over the primary S-Bahn lines for each major city in the same order we talked about the Stadtbahn systems. Dortmund sees service on the S1, S2, S4, and S5, although S4, which runs east-west through Dortmund, doesn't run through the Hauptbahnhof, instead connecting to S1 and S2 services at Dortmund-Dorsfeld station. S5 runs south, winding through the hills to the city of Hagen, east of Wuppertal, while S2 runs to Essen main station, with a short northern branch as well. S1 is sort of the main S-Bahn route for the entire region, running from Dortmund through Bochum, Essen, Mülheim, Duisburg, Düsseldorf, and then heading east to terminate at Solingen main station. Solingen is a fun little city for transit in and of itself, since it boasts a modest trolleybus network. Essen has the S3 route, which runs from its southeast through Mülheim to its west and northwest to Oberhausen. There's also S6, which terminates in Essen and runs south to Düsseldorf and Cologne, diverting around Duisburg. Finally, there's the S9, which runs west from Hagen to and through Wuppertal, north on another winding route through the hills to Essen and beyond to its north. The core of the network is at Düsseldorf Hauptbahnhof, where services radiate out to the north, east, south, and west, and services also pass through from the east to south, north to south, and east to west. Patterns which make sense because Düsseldorf Hauptbahnhof and its approach tracks run in a northeast-southwest direction, with the western and southern and northern and eastern approaches paired up. S11 runs from Düsseldorf Airport south through the city and then west and south to Cologne. S8 is an east-west route running from the west of Düsseldorf through the city and then east through Wuppertal to Hagen, meeting the S5 from Dortmund alongside the S9 from Essen. The S28 also runs east-west through Düsseldorf, while S7 runs from Wuppertal east and then south to Solingen, and both of these lines are operated using DMUs running every 20 minutes. While I won't talk about it in detail, since Cologne's S-Bahn is integrated with the Rhine-Ruhr S-Bahn network, I will mention that it has several routes running through its central station's main hall, including services to the Cologne-Bonn airport, and of course the S11 service to Düsseldorf and its airport, and the S6 service to Essen, both of which are technically Cologne services. These connections also prove valuable to passengers connecting to the many long-distance train services out of Cologne. Bonn also has an S-Bahn line in the S23, though it's entirely disconnected from the rest of the network. With so many lines running on distinct winding routes through hilly terrain, I am reminded a bit of Zurich, and the unfortunate reality is that outside of the approaches to Düsseldorf, services don't overlap a lot, and so service suffers into places like Essen. What's interesting about the Rhine-Ruhr S-Bahn is that unlike the very centralized S-Bahns of cities like Berlin and Munich, there aren't city center tunnels. However, there are a lot of impressive flyovers sorting train traffic into and out of cities. There are, however, the usual strategic tunnels, including a tiny stub into Düsseldorf Airport and a tunnel under Dortmund Technical University. Ironically, both of these locales have an extremely weird mode of transit, which you can use to get around them, hanging monorails. And no, you're not wrong, the Rhine-Ruhr region also has a third, the most famous hanging monorail in the world, the over-river Wuppertal-Schwebebahn. Now, this video is already long, so I'm not going to try to talk about these systems in detail, but the Tim Traveler has awesome videos on all three that I'll link in the description and a pinned comment, so go check those out for more on these wacky transit lines. Suffice to say, the route at Dortmund Technical University takes you around the campus, and at Düsseldorf Airport it takes you between the terminal area and the mainline rail station. And the Wuppertal-Schwäbebahn, well, it runs across Wuppertal. So how frequently do the S-Bahn services run? Well, most services through Düsseldorf run every 20 minutes, in line with those running through Cologne, while most services running to Essen and Dortmund are split between half-hourly and every 15 minutes on the core segments of S1, S2, and S4. Unfortunately, things are messy as transit operators try to run more and more service, with some routes like S1 having weird service patterns with different frequencies in different sections. The rolling stock is rather fun. Beyond just the Talent DMUs seen on services like the S7, there are also Stadler Flirts and Alstom-Coradia trains run on services in the region's southeast, while most services through Düsseldorf use the tried and true 42X trains that you'll see in cities like Munich, Frankfurt, and Stuttgart. Unfortunately though, like is an issue across Germany, there's not a true standard floor height, so even new rolling stock will have level boarding at some stations and lack it at others. So that's it. The Stadtbahns and the S-Bahn of the Rhine-Ruhr, an interconnected network for an interconnected city region that is unparalleled in the world. But as it turns out, there's an even faster frequent network in the Rhine-Ruhr region, designed to interconnect passengers across the huge distances seen on the S-Bahn in a fraction of the time. And you can learn all about it in the companion video to this video that's exclusively available on Nebula right now. Nebula is the streaming platform owned by me and my creator friends, featuring over 14,000 titles that you can watch ad-free, including exclusive and early access videos from urbanist creators like myself, City Nerd, City Beautiful, Life Where I'm From, and Not Just Bikes. We also have a news division and a film studio, where some of the very best content creators are creating excellent large-scale projects you won't be able to find anywhere else. The crew over at Jetlag the Game has just premiered the third iteration of Tag Your It, a continent-wide tag game across Europe featuring a lot of trains, and you can watch episodes 1 week early on Nebula to catch all of the action. Watching my channel Nebula is one of the best ways you can support it and my content as a whole, and as of now, lifetime memberships are back indefinitely for only $300, so you can pay once and get Nebula for as long as both you and Nebula exist, so Nebula can fund bigger projects in the near future. And if lifetime memberships are not your cup of tea, you can still support me for 40% off a yearly membership. We're also now offering annual gift cards so you can share my Nebula exclusive videos with your friends and family. So go check out Nebula at go.nebula.tv/rmtransit right now.